In Charleston, South Carolina, in the tense spring of the early 1800s, a story unfolded that few dared to speak aloud, and yet it passed through whispers in kitchens, markets, and fields. It was a tale of brutality and vengeance, of a woman whose name would be remembered long after the chains that bound her had turned to dust. Her name was Joanna. On the eve of Easter, when the city prepared for prayers, celebrations, and the ringing of church bells, Joanna prepared for something entirely different, an act that would shock both enslaved and masters alike. This is not a story of myths or legends. It is a story carved in flesh and fire, born from years of silence, humiliation, and unrelenting cruelty. On that night, Joanna turned the very weapon of oppression, the whip, against the men who had once wielded it over her back. The master and his sons, who had believed themselves untouchable, met their fate in screams that echoed across the plantation. Stay with us until the end of this video, because what happened in Charleston was more than an act of rage. It was a message that even in the darkest corners of bondage, there was resistance, there was defiance, and there was a spark of justice. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, leave a like on the video, and tell us in the comments from which city you are watching. Every story we share gains power when people around the world keep its memory alive. Joanna was not born into privilege, nor did she ever taste freedom as a child. From the very first days she could remember, the sound of the whip and the endless rhythm of labor shaped her world. She lived on a plantation just outside Charleston, where the sprawling fields of rice and cotton defined the lives of hundreds of enslaved men and women. Among them, Joanna stood out, not for rebellion at first, but for her strength, her resilience, and the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. She was known for her skill in the fields, moving faster than many with a precision that earned her a reputation. But more than her labor, Joanna possessed a sharp mind and a memory that made her invaluable to others. She could recall every instruction, every account of tools or baskets, and often helped others avoid mistakes that would have brought punishment. For the other enslaved people, she became a kind of anchor, someone to turn to for guidance, someone who shared her food when rations fell short, someone who spoke softly when spirits were low. Yet despite this respect among her own, Joanna's life was framed by the unyielding cruelty of her master and his sons. They admired her endurance, but despised her will. To them, Joanna's silence was not obedience, but defiance, her eyes carrying a weight they could not break. They saw her as a possession, a body to exploit, a back to scar when frustration overcame them. Every scar she bore was a reminder of her condition, but also a record of her survival. By day, she labored. By night, she carried the stories of her people, memories of mothers lost, brothers sold, children buried in unmarked graves. Joanna became both witness and keeper of grief. Those who worked beside her admired her strength, but they also saw her cage, a cage reinforced with cruelty and silence. Her existence was a paradox, respected in whispers, feared in silence, yet trapped within a system designed to erase every trace of her humanity. Joanna lived in the shadow of men who believed themselves gods on their land, but deep within her, there was something they could never claim, a fierce ember of defiance, a refusal to let her suffering be the only mark she left upon the earth. The moment that marked Joanna forever came on a sweltering summer afternoon, when the sun burned mercilessly over the Charleston fields. She had been working since dawn, her hands raw from the coarse cotton and her back slick with sweat. That day, one of the master's sons, barely a man but already drunk with power, demanded she work faster, harder, as though her body were not already broken from exhaustion. When she failed to meet his impossible pace, the whip cracked. Once, twice, then again, until her skin split open and blood streaked her dress. But the punishment did not end with the whip. Humiliation followed. They dragged her in front of the others, forcing her to kneel, mocking her with cruel laughter. Her dignity was stripped away while the enslaved community watched, unable to help, their own survival chained to silence. The master's voice was cold as he reminded them all. This is what happens when strength dares to resist. That day, Joanna's body was broken, but her spirit hardened. The pain of the lash became something different inside her, something sharper, more dangerous. As she lay on the dirt floor that night, her wounds burning, she whispered to herself that she would never forget. The laughter, the cruelty, the smugness on their faces, they burned into her memory with a clarity more painful than the whip itself. She buried her rage deep, because to show it openly would mean certain death. Yet inside her grew a silent vow. One day the whip would no longer belong to the master. One day the hand that had been forced to bow would rise, and the blood they spilled would be answered. She promised herself, not in words shouted aloud, but in the quiet space of her own mind, that the injustice would not last forever. Every lash, every humiliation, every scar became a record of debt, and Joanna, though she hid it behind lowered eyes and silent obedience, began to count the days when that debt would be paid. As the years passed, the weight of oppression on the Charleston plantation only grew heavier. The master aged but did not soften. Instead, he grew harsher, leaning on his sons to enforce discipline with cruelty that seemed to grow bolder each season. The whip cracked more often, food rations grew thinner, and the labor stretched longer into the night. For Joanna and the others, life became a cycle of punishment and survival, with little room left for hope. The sons, raised in their father's shadow, inherited not only his land, but also his thirst for domination. They strutted through the fields with the arrogance of young men who believed the world belonged to them, striking fear into the hearts of those who crossed their path. To them, cruelty was a form of entertainment. They singled out Joanna often, not only because of her strength, but because she represented something they could not control. Her silence enraged them, her endurance mocked their authority, and so they sought every chance to break her. Small acts of rebellion began to sprout among the enslaved, whispers of escape, hidden songs of resistance sung softly at night. Joanna listened, but she remained outwardly quiet. She was not reckless. Instead, she observed carefully. Every time the master drank too much, every moment the sons bickered among themselves, every gap in the patrol of the overseer, Joanna kept track. Her mind, sharpened by years of hardship, became a ledger of weakness, a secret inventory of opportunities, but the suffering around her became unbearable. She saw mothers lose their children to sails, men collapse under the sun and be left to die, women dragged away in the night with no one daring to speak, each cruelty layered upon the last until the air itself seemed to hum with unspoken rage. Joanna's vow, made years earlier in silence, grew stronger. She carried the memory of her humiliation like a flame hidden beneath ashes, waiting for the wind to rise. Every insult, every crack of the whip, every night of hunger fed that flame. She was no longer a woman merely surviving. She was a woman gathering power, her heart set on a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. The plantation lived under a false calm, the master and his sons convinced of their untouchable power. But beneath that calm, something darker brewed. Joanna was watching, waiting, and the moment when silence would turn into fire was drawing near. The breaking point came during the week leading up to Easter. The plantation bustled with preparations, for the master had invited neighboring families to a Sunday feast. The enslaved were ordered to work faster than ever, scrubbing the floors of the house, preparing food, polishing silver, and tending to the grounds until their bodies ached with exhaustion. Joanna, now hardened by years of endurance, moved with her usual precision. Yet her very steadiness drew the attention of the youngest son, a man quick to anger and eager to prove his dominance. Late one evening, as the others were dismissed, Joanna was ordered to remain behind. She stood silently as the son berated her, accusing her of arrogance, of disrespect, of working too slowly when she had done more than any other that day. His words were venom, but his actions were worse. With a cruel smirk, he struck her across the face before forcing her to her knees. In that moment, in the dim light of the hall, humiliation returned in its most bitter form. He laughed, calling his brothers to witness her correction. The three sons surrounded her, their voices sharp with mockery. The whip was brought out, and though she had endured it countless times before, something inside Joanna snapped as the leather tore across her skin. It was not the pain, she had long grown used to that, but the certainty that there would be no end, no future beyond their cruelty unless she made one herself. When the master himself entered, he did not stop them. Instead, he nodded with satisfaction, approving of their brutality. "This is how you keep them in line," he said coldly, sealing his role in her torment. That single moment branded itself into Joanna's heart. Father and sons united not only in blood, but in violence. As she was left crumpled on the floor, her back burning and her pride shattered once more, Joanna knew the time for waiting was over. This was no longer about her alone. It was about every scarred back in the quarters, every mother whose child had been taken, every man buried too soon. The injustice had reached its highest point, and from that night forward, there could be no return to silence. Lying awake on the dirt floor of her cabin, staring at the faint glow of moonlight through the cracks, Joanna whispered a vow once more. But this time, it was not a quiet promise buried in pain. It was a decision. The whip that had broken her body would soon serve a different master. After the night of her humiliation, Joanna's silence was no longer the quiet of survival. It was the silence of calculation. She walked among the quarters with her back bandaged, her steps measured, her face calm. To the master and his sons, she appeared broken once again, subdued into obedience. But to those who knew her, there was a different fire in her eyes. Slowly, she began to gather others around her. Not with loud words or reckless calls for rebellion, but with quiet conversations whispered in the shadows of the cabins and the cover of night. She spoke first to Miriam, a woman who had lost 2 children to the slave trade, her grief simmering into anger that had never found release. Then to Thomas, a strong field hand who bore the limp of an old injury from a beating, his body marked with scars that told a story of cruelty too long endured. One by one, she reached out to those whose pain had been buried beneath silence, those who carried wounds too deep to heal. Each of them brought their own story, their own reason to fight. For some, it was the children they had lost. For others, the families torn apart. Together, they wove these pieces of sorrow into something larger, something dangerous. Joanna listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her words cut sharp and clear. If we do not rise, they will never stop. They will do to our children what they have done to us, but if we act, even once, they will know we are not theirs to break. A plan began to form. Easter was approaching, and the master's family prepared to celebrate with wine, food, and pride. It was a night when the plantation would be filled with distraction, when the overseer's guard would lower, when the men who held the whip would drink until their tongues grew heavy and their steps unsteady. That night, Joanna told them, would be their moment. There was no turning back once the idea took root. They swore to one another in the dark, not with grand gestures, but with the clasp of hands, the meeting of eyes, the shared knowledge that death was a likely end. Yet death in resistance was better than life in chains. Joanna prepared the tools of their justice. The very whips that had carved scars into their flesh were taken quietly from the storerooms. Knives meant for butchering livestock were hidden beneath loose boards. Buckets of water and oil were moved to places where they could later serve their purpose. Every step of the plan was simple, yet precise. In the nights leading to Easter, the enslaved cabins carried a quiet tension. Mothers rocked their children to sleep while their eyes glimmered with fear and hope. Men lay awake, rehearsing in silence the blows they would strike. And at the center of it all stood Joanna, scarred, unbroken, and ready to lead them into a night from which there would be no return. The night of Easter Eve arrived cloaked in a deceptive calm. The plantation house glowed with lantern light, laughter spilling out into the night air as the master and his sons celebrated, their voices loud, their cups never empty. The aroma of roasted meat and spiced bread drifted across the yard, a cruel reminder to those in the quarters of the feast they had prepared but would never taste. Joanna waited in silence, her heart steady, her mind sharper than it had ever been. Around her, the small band of allies she had gathered moved into their places. Each step was rehearsed, each signal understood. For years they had lived under the shadow of the whip. Tonight, the shadow would fall in the other direction. Inside the house, the master leaned back in his chair, his sons shouting over one another in drunken pride. Their arrogance blinded them to the quiet movement outside, the shifting shadows drawing closer. Joanna stepped through the doorway first, her figure calm, almost serene, as if she had come only to serve. In her hand, hidden beneath the folds of her dress, the handle of the whip coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. The first blow fell before they could understand what was happening. The lash cracked across the youngest son's face, slicing skin and spilling blood. He screamed, stumbling backward, but Joanna's arm was relentless. Again and again the whip struck, each snap a memory answered, each lash a scar repaid. The other enslaved burst into the room, seizing knives, clubs, and the very tools that had once kept them chained. Panic tore through the house. The sons fought back, but drunkenness slowed their movements. One was dragged across the table, his head slammed against the wood until silence claimed him. Another was cornered near the hearth, flames throwing his shadow wild as Miriam drove a knife into his chest with the fury of a mother who had buried her children. The master, enraged and stumbling, tried to rally, but Joanna's whip coiled around his arm, ripping the cane from his hand. She struck him with a force that seemed to carry the weight of every enslaved soul he had broken. He fell to his knees, blood streaming down his face as the room filled with the cries of vengeance unleashed. For the first time, it was the oppressors who begged for mercy. And for the first time, no mercy was given. One by one, the master and his sons were beaten, lashed, cut down in the very house they had ruled with cruelty. Their screams echoed into the night, carried across the plantation like a warning and a promise. When the silence finally settled, Joanna stood in the center of the blood-stained floor, the whip hanging loose in her hand. Around her, the others panted, their bodies trembling from the release of years of rage. The masters of Charleston lay dead, their power broken in the same place where they had believed themselves untouchable. The house that had long stood as a fortress of cruelty now trembled under the weight of its own downfall. As the master and his sons lay lifeless, the enslaved stood frozen in the silence that followed, their chests heaving, their eyes wide with the realization of what had just been done. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Joanna lifted her chin, her voice calm yet commanding. "It is not finished." The act of vengeance was not enough. To leave the house standing would mean leaving behind a monument to the pain they had suffered, a place that could be reclaimed by the very system they had just defied. And so, with deliberate hands, they set about their final task. Oil that had been hidden days before was poured across the wooden floors, soaking into the walls and furniture. Candles were tipped, flames licking greedily at the soaked boards, climbing higher with each passing second. The fire caught quickly, fed by the dry timbers and the feast's leftovers still on the table. The laughter that had filled the rooms hours earlier was replaced by the roar of flames and the crash of beams collapsing. Smoke billowed into the night sky, carrying with it the ghosts of screams, the echoes of chains, the unspoken prayers of those who had endured too much. Outside, the enslaved gathered together, watching as the house burned. The glow illuminated their faces, not with fear, but with something new release. Some wept silently, tears cutting through soot-streaked cheeks. Others stood with arms crossed, their eyes reflecting the inferno. The fire was not only destroying wood and stone, it was consuming the memory of domination, purifying the land with the same weapon their oppressors had wielded for so long. Fear, Joanna stood at the front, the whip still hanging from her hand, its leather scorched at the edges. She raised it once, letting the firelight dance across it, and then threw it into the flames. The whip cracked as it burned, curling in on itself, a symbol destroyed forever. The quarters erupted in murmurs, some whispered prayers of thanks. Others clutched their children tightly, understanding that this act had sealed their fate, whether in freedom or death. But all of them, for that one night, felt the weight of bondage lift, if only for a fleeting moment. The fire spread until the house was nothing but a skeletal frame against the night sky, collapsing inward with a final groan. The plantation that had once seemed eternal now smoldered in ashes. And in those ashes, the enslaved found not only destruction, but a kind of rebirth, an unspoken truth that no master, no matter how cruel, was beyond the reach of justice. As the last beams of the plantation house fell into glowing embers, the night settled into an eerie quiet. The enslaved stood together outside the smoldering ruins, the air thick with smoke and the sharp scent of ash. For the first time in memory, there was no overseer's whistle, no barked orders, no crack of the whip. The silence itself felt like freedom, though all knew it could not last. Word spread quickly across the quarters. Those who had not been part of the plan emerged cautiously, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Some dropped to their knees, murmuring prayers of deliverance. Others looked to Joanna with a new kind of reverence, as though she had become something larger than life, a living symbol of resistance. Mothers held their children tighter, whispering that they had witnessed the night when bondage was broken, if only for a moment. But with that moment came danger. Everyone knew the fire, the deaths, could not be hidden. By dawn, neighbors would see the smoke rising over the fields, and soon the authorities of Charleston would descend with fury. The punishment for rebellion was always swift, always merciless, and they had not only defied their master, they had killed him and his heirs. Joanna understood this better than anyone. Standing before the group, her face lit by the dying fire, she spoke with a calm that steadied trembling hearts. "What we did tonight will not be forgotten. They will call it crime. We will call it justice. And even if we fall, they will know we were not silent. We were not theirs." Some pressed for escape, to slip into the woods and swamps before soldiers arrived. Others argued that they should scatter, hide among free black communities in the city, or seek refuge on distant plantations where news traveled slowly. But many, still trembling from the release of rage, could not imagine leaving the land where their families lay buried, where generations had toiled. For them, the act itself was enough. They had lived to see their oppressors fall. As night deepened, small groups made their choices. A handful slipped away under the cover of darkness, vanishing toward the marshes with hope of reaching the north or finding refuge among those who would shelter them. Others stayed, resolved to face whatever storm would come. By morning, rumors already began to ripple through the enslaved communities beyond Charleston. The story of Joanna, who had turned the whip against the master and his sons, traveled faster than any rider. To some, it was a warning. To many more, it was a promise that the chains could be broken, that even the most powerful were not untouchable. The cost would be heavy. Of this, they had no illusions. But for one night, the enslaved stood taller, and in the ashes of the master's house, a new kind of fire had been lit, one that could not be extinguished by soldiers or prisons or gallows. The fire of memory, of resistance, of a people no longer willing to bow in silence. By sunrise, Charleston stirred with alarm. Smoke rising above the plantation drew neighbors, then authorities, who arrived to find the house reduced to ashes and the master's family lying broken among the ruins. Soldiers and patrolmen flooded the fields, rounding up the enslaved with whips and rifles, demanding answers. Fear gripped many, but the silence among them was unshakable. None spoke Joanna's name, none betrayed the truth. Joanna herself did not flee. She stood at the edge of the smoldering wreckage, her back straight, her eyes steady, as if daring them to see what had been done. When they seized her, binding her hands and dragging her before the local magistrates, she did not resist. To them, she was just one woman, but to those who had stood with her through the night, she was already more than flesh. She was the embodiment of their rage, their courage, their will to fight back. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. There was no real defense, no chance of mercy. The master's family had been destroyed, and someone had to bear the punishment. Witnesses were threatened, interrogated, beaten, but still no one betrayed the others who had struck alongside her. Joanna carried the weight alone, her silence shielding them. When asked why she did it, she answered only once, "Because they thought we were not human. Now they know we are." The authorities condemned her to death. In Charleston Square, before a crowd gathered in grim silence, Joanna met her fate without bowing her head. Some said she walked to the gallows with a calm that unsettled even the soldiers, her gaze unwavering, her presence larger than the chains that bound her. The execution was meant to erase her act, to instill fear in those who remained enslaved. Instead, it breathed life into her story. In the quarters, in the kitchens, in the fields, whispers carried her name. Joanna of Charleston became a tale passed from mouth to mouth, a reminder that even under the heaviest chains, defiance was possible. For years after, mothers told their children of the woman who had taken the whip from the master's hand and turned it back against him. Men sang her name quietly in work songs, her memory woven into rhythms of endurance and hope. The authorities recorded her as a criminal, her name inked into dusty ledgers as a warning. But among the enslaved and their descendants, she lived on as a legend, one who dared to strike back, one who reminded them that even the most powerful could bleed. Joanna did not survive that Easter, but her story did. And in every whisper, every retelling, she became more than a woman, she became a symbol. a symbol that in the darkest hours, when silence was demanded, resistance could still rise, fierce and unbreakable, carrying the promise of freedom forward into memory.